Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. Amateur Traveler Podcast, Episode 67. Today, the Amateur Traveler Podcast goes to Edmonton and Jasper in Alberta, Canada.
I got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there, and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo. 15-hour flight, I don't think I'll ever be coming home. You know I love it. I got to see one more cathedral. I got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
Welcome to the Amateur Traveler Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Christensen.
We want to hear about the Thai puppetry show in Bangkok and the fashion catwalks of Milan. So what's your story? Visit Sheridan.com to share your story and get tips from fellow travelers.
Before we get into Canada, I have just two news stories for you today. The first one of a more general nature and the second one slightly more personal. So the first one is that the iPod is going into the air. In case you haven't seen the announcement already, iPod is teaming up with 6 airlines, Air France, Continental, Delta, Emirates, KLM, and United, to deliver iPod integration by as early as the middle of 2007. You'll be able to take your iPod, put it in the seat back in front of you, watch your movies or your TV shows on the screen in the seat in front of you, as well as charge your iPod while you go. I can hear a cry of hooray going up from harried flight attendants everywhere who will have a few less people to deal with who will be engrossed in the content on their iPods. So that's an interesting story. Secondly, I just got back yesterday from the first day of PodCamp West, where I spent some time hanging out with other podcasters, and I would like to use this opportunity to point out some other good podcasts that you might enjoy. I spent some time with Rob of the New York Minute Show. I don't know if you've heard his podcast, but if you're going to New York, that's definitely one I would check out. Also met a fellow who makes one of my favorite podcasts, Sparkle Tack, who's been on hiatus, says he's going to get back in the business. He makes a history podcast about San Francisco. I met Matthew Wayne Selznick, who made a audiobook that is an audiobook delivered as a podcast called Brave Men Run, which I've definitely enjoyed. And then I spent some time with the two fellows, Grant and Doug, behind The Radio Adventures of Dr. Floyd, which is a wonderful podcast. I think it's going to be the first podcast that makes it to mainstream media as two fellows in Hollywood looking for a break. It is a podcast for children of all ages, and so go check that out. Later on in the show, at the end of the show, I'm going to talk about the Amateur Traveler Podcast subscription day, so stay tuned for that. And also, for those of you who missed it in last week's show, because you don't watch the end of the show, I'll repeat an announcement I made in last week's show about a contest. Three years ago, my family and I, as we were talking about where we wanted to go for vacation, started talking about the Canadian Rockies. Now, the Canadian Rockies is someplace that I had been twice before, once as a kid and once on business, actually, which is a really great boondoggle. But we'll get into that story probably next week. So we looked at a map and we figured out where we wanted to go. And I had previously been to Calgary and to Banff and Lake Louise, which I'll talk about next week probably, and hadn't been really much further north of that. And really this time we wanted to get up to Jasper, a very wonderful, beautiful outdoor area. One of the reasons I thought about doing this show this week is, as we talked about Norway last week, which is spectacularly beautiful by all accounts, one person wrote me and said the only place they know that really they had been to that competes with Norway for sheer spectacular beauty was the Canadian Rockies. And so that just reminded me I'd been meaning to do this show for some time. I've got about 10 different interviews lined up coming up with all sorts of interesting people about some great destinations, but none of those quite lined up in this week. So I went back to my own stories and thought I'd tell you about the Canadian Rockies. Now, so this is a vacation that is intended to target natural beauty, right? Need to get that in your mind first of all. So it's a little odd that the very first stop on the trip was Edmonton, and the main reason we went to Edmonton was a mall. You probably have already heard that the world's largest, or maybe it's second largest right now, enclosed indoor mall in the world is in Edmonton. And so, since I was and still am the father of a teenage girl, this was more of a pilgrimage than anything else. So we flew into Calgary, and then we were planning on doing basically one big circuit, Calgary to Edmonton to Jasper to Banff to Calgary. And so we first drove the 3 hours basically between Calgary and Edmonton, and we found our hotel, which was downtown, which is interesting because downtown really shuts down a lot when it's not business hours, so it was a little harder to find a restaurant down there, for instance, that we expected a lot of them close or aren't open at dinner time. But we found a place to eat, and in the morning we got up and we drove to the mall, the West Edmonton Mall. And we went in the mall, and it was a mall. It was very much a letdown. We happened to go, as we now know, to what is the oldest part of the mall. And the mall was built in three main sections, as it turns out. And it was built in three different periods of time. And the mall we walked into was probably built when malls were originally built. And so we walked in, and there's the Radio Shack, and there's the Sears, and it looks like a mall. It looks like an old mall, actually. And we're thinking, well, gee, this doesn't seem like what we've been hearing about. And you walk a little further, and okay, now it's another mall. They're connected. Rather than tear down the old mall and build a new one, they basically just kept adding on in one direction. So you walk a little further, and okay, there's a Radio Shack, and there's another. I don't remember if there was another Sears, but there, you get to see a lot of the same stores. It's quite a large mall, as we said, and now it looks like a newer mall. So it still has a basic, gee, this looks like a mall, and what am I in Canada for? Look, and then you walk to the new section. And this is when you know you are not in your usual mall anymore, because there are a variety of things that you wouldn't normally find. There is a submarine ride. that in a large lagoon area that is going in there. There's a dolphin show. You can watch the dolphins do tricks as you're standing there with your orange Julius or whatever you have for your food. You can go into an aquarium. We didn't actually go into the aquarium, so I can't comment too much on that. There's a miniature golf course. There's a replica of the Santa Maria, Columbus's ship, the Santa Maria, full-size replica of the Santa Maria sitting in this mall, in a part of the same lagoon that's connected to where the submarine is at on the other end. There's a model of a humpback whale a full-size model of a humpback whale. There is a recreation little restaurant area of New Orleans with some different restaurants with a sort of a Mardi Gras theme. There's replicas of buildings from European style. There's an ice rink, of course. And then there's also, just off the side of the mall and enclosed, because this is Edmonton, we are fairly far north here in Canada. It does get very cold here. There is a water park. And this is one of the better water parks I've been into. And it's fairly enclosed because, it's very enclosed, right? It's very fairly compact. So the slides are literally sort of one on top of another. Great big long slides, slides that take you into what almost acts as if you were in a basin or a toilet where you spin around and then drop out a hole in the bottom. Group slides, individual slides, one of the largest wave pools I've ever seen. And my family happens to be, and I don't think we've mentioned this before because most of the water parks we've been to are local, happens to be a great fan of getting into the water, of the beach, of the ocean, of rivers, and of water parks. And so at this point, now the stop in Edmonton has for us been a worthwhile stop. And we knew that there was a water park there because we had read the tour books before we went, and so we had brought our gear. It was one of the reasons why when we came in originally to the mall and we just saw a regular mall, we were a little puzzled because we had read some of what we were going to see in this mall. There's also elsewhere in the mall, there's a miniature, you'd have to say a carnival with carnival rides and such. There are places where you can learn to ride trapezes and such. So they've really taken this area that is obviously very cold and probably a little inhospitable in the winter and turned it into some place that is that's a destination where you can go to and you can avoid all the outside surroundings and the cold Edmonton winter. And this is the Edmonton Mall. Technically, it's, I guess, the West Edmonton Mall is the official name of that. And I have links in the show notes to the mall site as well as on the iTunes Enhanced version, which also has pictures of all the things I've been describing for those of you who are not watching that on your computer or your iPod. Before I leave the mall, just a couple facts for you. One is 600 stores, $1.2 billion to build, 500,000 square meters, 5.4 million square feet. So quite large, 23,000 people are employed there. So there are, I understand, other things to do in Edmonton, and I love the Edmonton motto. The Edmonton motto at Edmonton.com is, visit Edmonton, it's cooler here. Which, if you're that far north, I think that's probably a good idea. In fact, they're actually having a prize right now, shopping spree and trip to Edmonton, so you might check that out. There are many other things to do in Edmonton, and I'm not going to spend a lot more time on that because that really wasn't the purpose of this trip, but there's an outdoor Shakespeare festival. They say there's one of the world's finest folk music festivals, as well as other things going on in Edmonton. Check that out on Edmonton.com, more information about Edmonton. But again, this trip wasn't about going to a mall and spending time in a food court. We really were trying to get out and see the Canadian Rockies. And very quickly after you get out of Edmonton, as you head towards Jasper, you get out of the city and you're in a very beautiful forested area. Before we got to Jasper National Park, we stopped at Miette Hot Springs, lovely little valley, and not only did we see the hot springs and the and the hot and cold water, both the glacier water, which is mixing with these hot springs coming out of the ground. But also we started to see some of the wildlife that we would see. We saw both deer and we saw 2 mountain goats just standing right near the parking lot. So we were just beginning to see some of the wildlife that we'd see on this drive. 2 things to note that we saw between Edmonton and Jasper. The first one is we just happened to be driving through this area when there were massive forest fires, both in the northern part of our trip and then also in the southern part. We went to Banff and Lake Louise, and I'll talk more about that later. But so we were actually driving past forests that were on fire. We could actually see them fairly close by. We were fortunately had a little bit of water separating us from them. So if you check out the pictures that I've taken in the website, amateurtraveler.com, or in the iTunes enhanced version, you may notice that quite a lot of them are a little hazy, and that's the reason for that. There was quite a lot of smoke in the air while we were there. The other thing I have to point out, and I've actually chosen to use this, you may have noticed in your podcatcher, a picture for this episode. So those of you who get an MP3 version, for instance, who watch it and who listen to it on iTunes get at least one picture, and that is the picture of the world's stupidest tourist. And we saw this fellow in between Edmonton and Jasper. And if you look at the picture, for those of you who have that, and I'll put it on the website for those of you who don't, it's a fellow standing who wanted to get his picture taken. I believe it was a French tourist, was my impression. He's wanting to get his picture taken with an elk. And this is a bull elk, I believe is what you'd call a male, but it's a large elk with very large antlers. And he basically is approaching this elk because he wants to get really close to it so he can have his picture taken. And he would back up next to it, and it would back further away because it was very uncomfortable, and he would back up next to it. And finally his friends took a picture of him, and I took a snapshot at the same time with a zoom. I would point out, I'm not standing quite as close as he is, of this fellow who's standing right next to this elk. And it didn't take me very long to find a story about a man who was killed by an elk even though he was wearing a very thick jacket. This tourist was wearing just shorts, no shirt even. So not something I would recommend. Not a very bright move. This is a wild animal, despite the fact that it was very near the highway and very easy to be seen. There is a lot of wildlife in this area, and that's one of the things I like about it. One of the things I like about Jasper is, unlike Banff and Lake Louise area, which I'll talk about in the Canadian Rockies, which get a lot of tourists in a year, Jasper's a little more out of the way. There aren't a lot of big hotels in Jasper, and just gets a lot less tourists because it's just too far, which is why I had never been there before. It's the same reason. It's just a little too far to go to unless you do either fly into Edmonton or take the time to drive the whole big circle route, starting in any particular place: Edmonton, Jasper, Banff, Calgary. Now, Jasper is a Canadian national park, and as I said, with a lot of wildlife, they actually recommend the best times of years to visit Jasper if you're looking for wildlife are March to June, and then in the fall from September to November. And I suspect the big reason for that is you'll get most of your tourists in July and August, and therefore you'll get a little less of the animals. And there's grizzly bears, black bears, caribou, elk, moose, wolves, all sorts of different things, as well as smaller animals, marmots, pikas, ground squirrels, lots of birds, bald eagles, all sorts of things in Jasper National Park as far as wildlife. Jasper National Park is the northernmost and largest of the Canadian national parks, and it was declared a UNESCO or United Nations Heritage Site, something that is to be preserved for all people. And there's all sorts of outdoor activities in Jasper. Jasper is really a good place to go if you want to get outside. Hiking, backpacking, mountain biking, boating, camping, all of those in the summer, fishing obviously, horseback riding, and then in the winter time, more of your skiing, your cross-country skiing. So definitely a place that is more geared around outside activities. And I'm going to recommend a few different places to go in the Jasper National Park, and I think there are really 3 places that are must-sees. The first one is Whistler's Mountain. In Whistler's Mountain, there's a gondola that goes up that looks down over Jasper, and you can see for quite a ways from this mountain of the whole Canadian Rockies, or the northern part of the Canadian Rockies here. So it's an easy gondola ride up, and then you can then hike further up to the top of the mountain here to have this particularly spectacular view. I will say that this is in many ways a breathtaking hike, both from the fact that it is steep, you're high up, and the scenery. It is, on all three counts, breathtaking. And so this is something that probably you're going to skip if you're not in decent physical shape. You don't have to be an athlete, but a little more than a couch potato would be good for this. And checking my notes from our travel journal, I see that the tram goes up to about 7,500 feet, just about 4 feet shy of 7,500 feet. And then the trail is only about a 1.3 kilometers, so it's not that long, but it goes up another 600 feet. And since you're over a mile high, if you're not used to that elevation, not all of my family made it all the way to the summit. It was a bit of a steep climb at that point. And on the way back from the tram to Jasper, we ran into a traffic jam, which you don't expect to in Jasper, but it was just exactly the kind of traffic jam that we had come to Jasper for, because basically all the traffic was held up because 7 female elk had decided to wander slowly across the road, and of course all of the tourists in us were pulling over to take pictures of these beautiful animals. The second one is more accessible to everybody, and that is going to be Malign Canyon and Malign Lake. And Malign Canyon and Malign Lake is one trip, although 2 different locations on the same river. And so first go to the canyon and do the hike up and down the canyon. It's fairly level, and it's basically a small river that is cut through a thin rock canyon. And so it's just a very beautiful, nice little leisurely walk, unlike the gondola, which I mentioned previously. So do that. It's lovely. I'll put some pictures in of that. The whole hike is only about 3 miles, and the guidebook generally recommends doing it from the north end to the south end, which would be from the bottom of the canyon to the top of the canyon against the flow of the river. We actually did it the other way around because we weren't sure we wanted to do the whole thing. The most spectacularly beautiful part of the hike is the southern or upper end of the canyon. So if, like us, you're not sure you want to do the whole hike, we only did about 2/3 of it, definitely make sure that the part that you do is the southern end of the canyon. And then go to Malign Lake. And Malign Lake is, take the boat tour on Malign Lake and go to the other side and go to Spirit Island on Malign Lake. And that's going to be something that's going to be very photographed. It's a very beautiful scene. But the whole boat ride and just the whole area here, as you see some of the glaciers coming down into the lake, it's just a picturesque, picture-perfect sort of place. The lake is about 22 kilometers long, and it's ringed with snow-capped mountains, and so just a beautiful, gorgeous place. The whole tour of the lake will take about 90 minutes, and it is a guided tour with a guide explaining a lot about the history and the geology of the lake and of the area. And except for my son, who was exhausted and slept through a lot of it, the rest of us particularly enjoyed that particular trip. And then we went back into Jasper. I'd recommend for dinner the Alpine Grill, which has pizza, pasta, as well as Korean and stir fries. So it smelled wonderful, which is what drew us in. And the third thing I'm going to recommend, and this is a little bit cheating because I said a third as if it were one place, it's really a drive. And it's really the drive from Jasper south to the Columbian Ice Fields on the Ice Fields Parkway. And you're going to stop some places. There's 2 waterfalls particularly of note, the Athabasca Falls as well as the Sumkapta Falls, that are worth a stop, as well as numerous other places to pull out and take picture and see, just the beautiful scenery here of the Canadian Rockies, and it really is just gorgeous. But one of the places you're not going to miss is the Columbian Ice Fields. You're going to get to the Columbian Ice Fields, and you're going to get there in time to go on a tour of the big buses that will go out on the Athabascan Glacier. Now, I say this with some insistence, and the reason I do is I have been to the Columbian Ice Fields and the Athabascan Glacier 3 times. And actually, I have seen how much it has receded since I was there the first time. The first time I would have been there probably around 1970 or so as a child. And when I went there as a kid, I really, really wanted to go out on the glacier. And my dad said, well, it's going to take too long. And we actually ended up waiting the hour that it would have taken doing other things around there anyway, and didn't get a chance to go out. So when I got back to the Canadian Rockies, because I went to a conference in Banff, a computer and human interface CHI conference in Banff, I took two of my coworkers and I dragged them along, and we went after the conference up to the Columbian ice fields to go out on the Athabascan Glacier, and it was closed because the conference was in October, and this is not something that is open year-round. So this is something you need to go there in the summertime to get to. So finally this trip I was able to go with my family and to go out, and you get in a big snow coach. It's a great big bus, great big tires, and they drive you out on to the glacier, and you're driving past some crevasses and some things. And the Athabascan Glacier, as it comes down here over the top of the hill and down to where you can see it from the Columbian ice fields, the ice there that you're standing on when you're standing on this is taller than the Statue of Liberty. You're standing on about 11,000 feet, 1,100 feet of ice, as I recall, and you're leaning into the streams of melting ice to fill up your water bottle and taste what a glacier tastes like. Or if you're my son, you're leaning in and falling into a stream of melted glacier, which I'm told is rather cold, actually. And I don't know for sure that you will find it as spectacular as I did standing on a glacier, but it certainly was a memorable experience for me to finally get a chance to do that as an adult, which I didn't get a chance to do as a kid. Anyway, that's the first part of the story of this trip to Alberta. I'm not sure whether I'll finish the story next week because of some of the interviews I have, or whether I'll finish it in the future, but I will finish it. And my overall impressions of the Canadian Rockies are just the beauty of the snow-capped mountains, the glaciers, the forests, the beautiful blue water that you get from the runoff from the glaciers. That is just very spectacular. We saw a lot of different animals. The one thing we did not see on this particular trip was the majestic moose, although I did get a picture of my daughter pretending to be one, which is close enough. Here in the Internet Resources part of the show, I have 3 resources for you. The first one, since this show talked about traveling with my kids, is a site just for that purpose. It's called kidscantravel.com, and basically it features tips for traveling with kids, like what luggage to take, how to entertain kids, all sorts of interesting things there. Check that out, kidscantravel.com. The second one is yet another site for travel guides to particular cities. This one's called 10 Toe Tours. Just like the sound of it. And it's 10toetours.com. You can browse by city and look at various sites. For instance, right now they have apparently 4 cities: New Orleans, San Francisco, Sausalito, and Washington, D.C. And then they might have multiple trips for each city. So San Francisco has, for instance, both an Embarcadero boot camp workout as well as a Union Square shopping tour. So check out that site at 10 Toe Tours. On a similar note, you might check out a site called podguides.net, and that has a relatively small but nice set of walking tours for Europe, for France, Belgium, and England so far. Podguides.net. One thing I like about the Podguides is they are also enhanced podcasts like The Amateur Traveler, and they also include maps that show you where things are. So a nice job at that. In the community section of the show, I had a real interesting letter this week from Beth, who's a listener and is hoping to do a podcast of her own. She's going off on a 6-month to 1-year-long trip as an archaeologist, heading to Egypt, United Arab Emirates, Thailand, and France for sure, possibly Greece, Turkey, Croatia, and or Tanzania. So I will certainly tell you more about that if it happens. Beth, send us some more information. I'd be glad to plug your podcast. Sounds very interesting, and perhaps we'll have Beth on the show as she gets further into her trip. 2 other announcements then. One is, while I was at the PodCamp West, I talked to Scott from Apple Computer, who is in charge of the iTunes directory, and mentioned to him that I'm a little frustrated that the Amateur Traveler doesn't show up in the featured podcasts. And I found out that featured podcasts are no longer being chosen manually, but instead are being chosen algorithmically or automatically by software. And basically what drives it is which podcasts get more subscriptions, which tends to be the featured podcasts. So what I'd like to do, on his suggestion, is encourage people to kind of clump their subscriptions. So 2 days coming up here, one in November and one in December, I'd like to declare subscribe to amateurtraveler.com day. And those would be November 28th and then December 14th. And I'm picking those particular dates because they'd be a real nice present for me. November 28th is my 25th wedding anniversary, and December 14th is my 46th birthday. So I would like to encourage everyone who is interested in hearing more about what's going on in the show, and we have lots of things coming up. I have interviews scheduled for Machu Picchu in Peru, for London, for Liverpool, which is Europe's cultural spot for the next year. I have an interview scheduled with an airline pilot who also does a podcast, and you perhaps can guess who that is, as well as a number of other interesting interviews coming up. That's just the ones I can think of off the top of my head. So you'll want to subscribe, and if you have any questions on how to subscribe, send me an email at host@amateurtraveler.com, or check out the link on amateurtraveler.com where I have some basic description of how to subscribe, especially if you want to do so in iTunes, which is what most people are using to subscribe. The more people subscribe, the more publicity the podcast will get, and that really helps me get some motivation to put it out on a regular basis, which I'm continuing to do so. Thanks to Sheraton for sponsoring this show, as you may have heard the ad at the beginning of the show. And then finally, I mentioned something at the beginning of the show about a contest. For those of you who may have missed it in the last show, I'm doing a contest between now and the end of this year, 2006, where I'm trying to drive traffic to the discussion boards, amateurtraveler.com/board. And basically the way it works is this: I'm going to give away an iPod Shuffle at random to somebody who posts on the board a post that is of value. And so basically I'm not encouraging people to spam the board, but to talk about their travels, to ask questions, to answer questions. And so on New Year's Day, I will pick a post from the board that has been posted before that day, anytime through then, and that person will win an iPod Shuffle. Plus, if the total number of posts of value at the board at that time is more than 1,000 posts, then instead of a shuffle, it will be a red iPod, the iPod Nano red version. So there's your incentive. I hope to encourage people to learn more about each other by going on the discussion board, so I'm hoping it'll be a win-win for all of us, even those of you who don't happen to win the contest. That's the Amateur Traveler for this week. Thanks so much for listening.
See one more cathedral, I got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
The best and the brightest served up daily by the sharpest minds in content delivery, pod show, and limelight.